Let's take a look at some ways to evaluate a used revolver. So if you were planning on purchasing a used revolver, there's lots of things to look for. It can be intimidating. So I'm going to give you some tips that I use when I'm buying a used revolver that you can add to your toolbox. So first thing I'm going to do, if I'm buying a revolver at a gun show or a gun shop or from a private individual, I'm going to take a quick overall look just to look for any obvious damage or repairs. If I'm familiar with the revolver, I'm seeing if there's any modifications or add-ons to it. Once I'm sure that it seems like it's in good shape, I'm going to start to scrutinize a little bit more detail. So let's take a closer look. Looking at the finish on this one, it's a 44 Magnum Taurus. It seems to have quite a few scratches, but nothing that couldn't be buffed out. So this kind of falls in line with what I think this one would be used for, a hunting revolver, and that would be expected to see some scrapes and things from twigs and whatnot as you're walking with it. We can see that there's some fouling there at the top of the break where it's been cleaned but not scrubbed down to bare metal, which indicates that it's probably gotten some use but not a lot, and it gives you some indication of the type of owner. So looking down at some of the more closer details, again we're looking at the edges and the corners to make sure there's no obvious dings or dents. You also want to make sure everything's still symmetrical, and that gives you an indication of any repairs that might have been done. So everything seems real solid on this one. The rubber grip, this type of rubber, it gets kind of shiny when it's used a lot. It also gets kind of dry rotted when it's stored for a long time. And this one's kind of a little bit of both. It's not brand new for sure, but the high spots are not really shiny yet, so it's been used but not used up, and it's not worn out. The rubber itself isn't quite dry rotted, but you can tell this thing's probably sat a lot. And again, that kind of goes in line with it being a hunting revolver that you'd probably only use a few times a year. So again, we don't see any obvious damage, so let's spend a little more time with it. First we're going to open it up and again take a look at that cylinder. We want to make sure everything's concentric so that this, in other words, this line, this pin is still straight. We're not looking for any warps or any problems. This is a pretty heavy cylinder, so it's not going to spin like some of the little 38 cylinders, but we want to kind of spin it if we can, and again just to make sure everything's concentric there. We're also going to not pay attention to the cylinder now, but we're paying attention to this hinge. And we're going to open it a few times and just make sure that everything's locking up nice and strong. Now I'm not trying to spin the cylinder here. I'm pulling back and forth on this hinge to see how strong everything is. And although that internal pin moved a little bit, the lockup is great. So I think this is showing us that nobody's been doing this to this thing. Like in the movies, they always slap them closed. That's really not good for this hinge, and that shows us that this one hasn't been abused like that. So digging in a little bit further, we want to look at operation some more. We'll look at the ejectors. Nothing's damaged or warped or anything. An indication somebody might not know how to work the thing and have bent something, gotten something stuck up, and again it shows us that everything's nice and clean there. An indication of the type of use it's had. We can see that there's some fouling from powder along the front of the cylinder there and up around the forcing cone. There's no damage to the top of the frame though, and no corrosion, so although it's been used and not cleaned, scrubbed totally clean, it hasn't been totally neglected either. Looking at the back of the frame, especially on a large caliber like this one, we expect to see a round spot of copper there where the shells are pushed back as the cartridge goes off, but this one hasn't even developed a real brass spot yet. And you can see the fouling from both of the empty cartridges. That's an indication this one's been used for training, where somebody will put one cartridge in and then skip a chamber and put in two more. That way you can practice your flinching or your trigger control. And again, seeing powder fouling tells us that powder came through here and back into there. So this has probably been used for training more recently than it's been used for hunting, but it's definitely not been used with overpressure loads, especially on a high caliber like this. If we were using high pressure loads, we might expect to see other kind of marks there where the other rounds are pushed back as the high power load goes off. So again, this is an indication that this thing's been used but not used up. So now let's look at the actual mechanics there. We can tell that for all indications it's been used but not hurt. Let's make sure that's true with the operation. So this is a double action revolver. We know that if the trigger is pulled, the hammer is going to go first back and then drop. And that's what happens, so we can expect that. And we're going to do that with each chamber. And what I'm doing here is after I let go of the trigger, I'm making sure that it's still locked up. In other words, that on a revolver, obviously the cylinder has to revolve for the next chamber to come into place. I want to make sure that it's locked up and not caught, you know, halfway between the chamber. Everything looks good there. So now let's check the lock up as far as the round going off. So we're going to bring it back to a single action, and we're going to hold the hammer back, but let the trigger go. Oops. Let the trigger go, and then we want to work the cylinder, and see there's no real movement there. So that tells us that as the hammer is going forward, about to, you know, shoot the round off, that it's all locked up nice and tight and everything's in line. So now let's go to the next chamber. Again, great lockup. The next one, it's actually a little bit of movement on that one. The next one, a little bit of movement. A little less movement. And then almost none on that one. So that's telling us that it's out of tune a little bit. And revolvers can, especially on a high caliber like this again, kind of shoot themselves loose a little bit, and this one might need a little tune-up. The nice thing is, when we look at the brand, it's a Taurus, so although it's not always going to go back to the factory, when they do go back to the factory down in Brazil, they usually come back in great working shape. So I don't think this one needs to go down, but if it ever did, you'd have the knowledge that it'll come back and you'll have a good working one again. You of course want to make sure that the sights are, you know, working. You want to touch them a little bit, make sure they're not just like held on with glue, but you know, that they're going to hold up to their recoil. But these seem to be in great shape, and again, another indication that it's used and paid attention to. Hopefully those tips will give you some idea of you know, what to look for when you're buying a used revolver. If you've got any other questions or concerns, please leave them in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.
The guys and gals at gunwebsite.com encourage you to take a CCW course every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thanks for watching gunwebsites.com.